So, glad to be here. Glad you could make it today. Let me know if my voice is breaking up or if I can't be heard. We can perhaps do this by phone if there's a problem with the system. So Matt has made, I think, a clear presentation of the fact that the world is now fairly openly divided into two totally different paradigms. Well, we already have a problem. Is it hard to hear me?
No, the other way. No, it's fine.
It's fine. Okay. All right. Two very, very different paradigms where in the United States and in Europe you have what is clearly a dying economy. Mr. LaRouche has warned since the 1960s that the financial policies being followed in the West were leading to a disaster that would lead to a global economic breakdown and probably a new global war. Every forecast he made of systemic breakdowns came true, and the solution adopted by the City of London and the Wall Street banking interests took exactly the wrong solution to each of those crises. 1971, when the dollar collapsed and they took the dollar off of gold, and a series of developments leading up through the 1990s when the core policy that Roosevelt had launched to save not only America, but to save the world in the 1930s, which was his Glass-Steagall Act, the act which forcefully separated the investment banks from the commercial banks and provided government support for commercial bankers, but they were forbidden to invest in any kind of speculation in stocks and bonds or insurance or derivatives. And the investment bankers who were allowed to continue speculating got zero government support. If they fell, they fell. That sustained growth in America for 70 years. And in the 1990s, that was taken down under Alan Greenspan as the Federal Reserve Chief, and his increasing control, Wall Street's increasing control over our government, over the Congress, and since we've had the Bushes and the Obama administrations over the White House as well. At the same time, the takedown of Glass-Steagall unleashed wild speculation, which began under the George Bush administration and continued under Obama and in Europe, where every time there was a crisis, like the 2007 and 8 crisis, the solution was to print trillions of dollars to bail out the banks while allowing the physical economy to continue to collapse, as has continued. We're now in a situation since the so-called bailout of 2007 and 8, where the derivative bubble is half again larger than it was at the time of the collapse in 2007 and 8, because they have allowed the wild speculation to continue and expand. The quantitative easing, the printing of trillions, not billions, but trillions of dollars to buy up worthless speculative paper from the banks has now been launched in Europe. As of last Monday, the European Central Bank is now implementing quantitative easing. And in fact, it's already failing. I won't go through the details of that unless one of you would like to discuss it in the Q&A. But it's failing precisely because they've been living with zero interest rates and basically free money, none of it going into the economy, all of it dictated by the Troika, the IMF, the ECB, and the European Union, which have demanded that any loans go only to bail out debt and require conditions of shutting down state sector industries, laying off workers, cutting pensions. And at the same time, we've had a cultural decay, which I think is unprecedented since the great 14th century Black Death. We have the collapse of great art, the collapse of music into wild Dionysic noise called popular music. We not only have given up the war on drugs, we're now legalizing drugs under the leading of people like George Soros, a leading hedge fund speculator who finances the legalization of drugs in America and around the world. This is a collapse of civilization. And I will discuss later, it's this that's leading us to war. On the other hand, you have the BRICS, building everywhere, building high-speed railroad across Africa, across South America, where in the past the European colonial powers only built railroads from the ports to the mine. And you can see that if you look in that Eurasian Land Bridge report that we have there, on the chapter on Africa, there's a beautiful map contrasting the existing rail structure in Africa, which is just railroads from the ports to the mine. That's all the European colonial powers were interested in. And then a map of what's being planned, largely by China, but others as well, connecting every capital with high-speed rail, crisscrossing, crossing the continent. The same thing in South America. So building water projects, canals, nuclear power plants, going to South Africa, going to Argentina. This is a clear case of two totally contrary paradigms, which, if not resolved in favor of the development paradigm, could and will lead us to not only a horrible global economic breakdown, but world war. Now, before I go into that, I want to do a little historical reflection, because in my mind, what happened in the 15th century, the beginning of the 15th century, is very, very similar to the situation we have today. At that time, Europe had gone through a true dark age in the 14th century. The Mongol invasions of Asia and the Middle East and Europe, bringing the plague with it, had laid waste to most of civilization as it existed at that time. The Black Death swept Europe, killing off about 1/3 of its population. And the existing kingdoms of Europe were caught up in perpetual warfare, battling each other, until a 17-year-old girl in France, Joan d'Arc, believing she'd been called on by God to lead France's armies against the British occupiers, mobilized the country, mobilized the army, and literally at the age of 18 and 19, led the army to defeat the British occupiers. She was then betrayed by the king that she saved and turned over to the British, who, along with their French satrapies, burned her at the stake, a hideous death after a trial, which is still documented today and worth reading, but burned her at the stake. But that very act, her selfless act of putting her life, however short it may be, at the service of the common aims of mankind, so inspired others in Europe, and especially Nicholas of Pisa, the great German cardinal, who, working with the Pope, forced a new trial of Joan of Arc, but also in his publications developed the concept of the sovereign nation state, developed the idea that nations should be governed by the consent of the governed, and that the interests of the sovereign nation state in foreign policy should be that their interests were the same as the interests of the others, and that this was the basis on which sovereign nation states could not only coexist, but collaborate on development. And this concept from the Peace of Westphalia of the sovereign nation state was the basis upon which the great European Renaissance unfolded, where you had great scientists like Nicholas of Pisa and like Kepler, who followed him, who recognized that the laws of the universe, the laws of the solar system, were the same as the laws of the human mind, and the same as the laws of the musical scale, which is why he called his study the harmony of the universe. And in that way, by examining the human mind, actually discovering the principles of the universe. This led then to Bach, who studied Kepler's work, and to the great music of Beethoven and Brahms, and so forth. So at the same time that you had this burst of development and a renaissance in Europe, look at China. In precisely the same period, beginning in 1405, the Chinese unleashed what became a series of 7 mass voyages by treasure ships, what they called treasure ships, where these armadas went down through the South China Sea, through the Malacca Straits, into the Indian Ocean, to Sri Lanka, to India, into the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, down to the Gulf of Aden. And in fact, the admiral who ran these fleets, Zheng He, was a Muslim. And a group from these fleets went to Mecca and to Egypt. They went down the African coast as far as Madagascar and Mozambique. And these were peaceful voyages, huge armadas. There were 317 ships in this armada, 317 ships. There was never an armada that size in the world until the Second World War. This was in 1405. So the 62 of those ships were these so-called treasure ships, which were huge. The science of travel was discovered by the Chinese. These ships were 3 times bigger than anything you had in Europe. The 3 ships that brought Columbus to the Americas were about 1/3 the size of these treasure ships. And that was a century later, 1492. So you see what was going on in civilization at that time. What happened in China is that this process, for reasons that are still not clear to me, historians have various explanations, but for various reasons the Chinese turned in on themselves, very much the way they did during the Cultural Revolution, when they, for reasons that are, I think, explainable, but they turned away from the rest of the world and turned in on themselves, and ended up largely destroying themselves. And the same thing happened in China in the 1430s. After 7 of these voyages, they banned the voyages. Some of the ships were burned. A lot of the records were burned. And they banned all foreign travel. And China suffered for it and decayed. And so that went on various directions. But if you look at what happened in Asia at that time, this potential for China to discover the world and build the world, collapsed. In Europe, you had, because of a few key individuals, the launching of this great Renaissance. Now, as we all know, that Renaissance also gave rise to the British Empire's use of the science and technology to impose their evil, drug-running, slave-running operations on a worldwide scale. But let's look at today. Now you have the West collapsing, as we've just discussed. They're shutting down their nuclear power plants. Germany, the greatest power in Europe, shutting down its entire nuclear industry. The U.S. basically has already shut it down. We're building a plant or 2 now, but we haven't built one since the 1970s. Japan, after the tsunami, which had instigated the Fukushima accident, in which, by the way, no one was killed. Thousands were killed in the tsunami, but no one was killed by that very serious nuclear accident. And yet, it was used to justify shutting down nuclear power globally by the Western financial oligarchs. And the Japanese, in my mind, foolishly have allowed their entire nuclear industry to collapse. And it's only slowly being discussed even to bring it back. The U.S. gave up on manned space travel. Obama banned manned space travel. We have to depend now on the Russians to take us to our own space station. And the Russians, despite the fact that we're threatening thermonuclear war against them, are continuing to take our people up to our space station, which I think is an irony worth noting. So, with this collapse sweeping the West, with the quantitative easing, as I indicated, the printing of money, as Matt said, the idea that money is the economy is the core of the evil that has brought down Western civilization. The American system, as developed by our founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, our first treasurer, made very clear that money was not the root of a nation's power. It was credit and development. Credit as opposed to monetary systems. the idea of investing in a future and creating a future, which was what America discovered in a real sense through Alexander Hamilton's economic policies, refuting the central bank policies of Europe. And that policy, again, was defeated and rebuilt and defeated and rebuilt through U.S. history. The last great one being Franklin Roosevelt, who restored this American system of credit. And in the midst of the worst depression in history at that time, nonetheless unleashed the greatest infrastructure development program the world had ever seen throughout the United States. And had he lived past World War II, would have brought that policy to the rest of the world. We didn't. We chose instead to go into a Cold War and restore colonial policies, backing the British, going back into their colonies, which Roosevelt swore he would not let happen. But we did, under Truman and under subsequent leaders. So, again, while Europe is now the collapsing side of this paradigm, you have this BRICS process being unleashed not only in China, but around the world. Almost all of South America has joined with the BRICS. Almost all of Africa has joined with the BRICS. Almost all of Asia. So when Obama talks about Putin being isolated, the irony, of course, is that the US and Europe are isolated from most of the world, who are moving ahead with what America used to do, what we used to be proud of doing in the United States, which is building nations, building our own and building other nations. So a little history on this. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, that report that's on the desk there that you have, this report, which if you don't have already, I strongly encourage you all to purchase a copy of this, we put this together over the last year. I was one of the major authors, part of this. But it has a long history. Back in the when the Soviet Union fell and the wall came down in Germany, Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche said, this is a great moment, a great opportunity to end the idea of war forever, to end the Cold War, but to end the idea of war. To do that, they said, we must build collaborative development across Eurasia, and what they called the New Silk Road. The idea being to build rail connections between Europe and Asia, building them as development corridors, building new cities along the way, opening up the vast areas of Central Asia and the Russian Far East that are very underpopulated and underdeveloped. And to use this as a project for all of mankind. In other words, the world uniting around the development of this undeveloped continent of Eurasia. The West rejected that, absolutely. They chose instead to renege on their promise to the Russians that they would not expand NATO, and chose instead to expand NATO right up to the Russian borders, which we now see leading us into a potential thermonuclear confrontation with Russia. An insane policy of threatening war if Putin and Xi Jinping do not back down. But the Chinese at the time adopted the idea. They adopted it, they called it the Eurasian Land Bridge, and they began immediately, back in the 1990s, to begin this process. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, with the Chinese government and others, organized a huge conference in Beijing in 1996 on the Eurasian Land Bridge. And we published a report just as big as that one on that conference. At the time, the Chinese didn't have great resources. So they did what they could to begin the process of building a new land bridge rail connection through Central Asia, rebuilding the Siberian rail line, and beginning talking about a southern route down through Southeast Asia, into India, down into the Middle East. That didn't get very far, and it's still in its very early stage. But the one through Central Asia was constructed. In fact, you probably read that just a couple of weeks ago, the first round trip took place between Yiwu in China, all the way through China, through Kazakhstan, into Russia, down through Europe, all the way to Madrid in 3 weeks, 8,000 miles. And then a return trip, the first round trip on this new Silk Road rail connection, Eurasian Land Bridge. And there's a great deal more to go. But this process is underway. Mrs. LaRouche became known in China as the Silk Road Lady, something we're proud of. I was able to travel with her to China last February, and she's been there again since then, where she is recognized as the architect of what Xi Jinping has now officially adopted as Chinese policy, the new Silk Road, what they call the new Silk Road economic belt, and the new maritime Silk Road down through Southeast Asia, basically following the road of Zheng He back in the 1400s. The idea of developing these maritime routes as new ports, trade facilities, and so forth. So this includes, this new Silk Road approach includes, as I said, new canals. They're building, the Egyptians, who are not in the BRICS, but who are collaborating with the BRICS, they're building a new Suez Canal. In Nicaragua, they're building a new Panama Canal with the Chinese assistance. We may see the beginning of something that Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche and myself have fought for 25 years, which is the building of a canal in southern Thailand called the Kra Canal, to turn southern Thailand into a hub for the entire development of the Pacific and Indian Ocean basin. So these projects are moving forward. As I said, the rail connections, they're going to space. They're proceeding with nuclear power, and more importantly, even fusion power, which is a major subject in that report. The urgency of unleashing a full-scale fusion power project, which if America had lived up to the schedule put together by John F. Kennedy, we would have fusion power online today and have unlimited energy available to the human race for the next 10,000 years. We also were, at the time, planning to use our colonization of the moon to mine helium-3, which is by far and away the best resource for fusion power, which is very scarce on Earth because of the magnetic field around the Earth. The helium-3 thrown off by the moon, however, gathers in great quantities, by the sun, gathers in great quantities on the moon. And the Chinese are now leading the effort to mine helium-3 to bring it back to fuel fusion power to resolve the energy issue for essentially the rest of mankind. So these are the kinds of developments that are being unleashed. I want to point out also that the maritime Silk Road, which now passes up through the Gulf of Aden, through the Red Sea, and through the the Suez Canal, and will pass through the new Suez Canal as that is constructed, is seeing as one of its final points the port of Piraeus in Greece. Now, you know what's happening in Greece. It's being torn to pieces by the European Union and the IMF. And they have stood up and said, no, we won't take it. Now, the EU is threatening to isolate Greece, to cut them off, to force them out of the euro, perhaps. But Greece is not only collaborating with Russia, but they're very much collaborating with China. The Chinese have already taken a 35-year contract to work on the Piraeus port, the Athens port. They want that to be the entrepot for all of Europe for the Silk Road, maritime Silk Road process. They went to Serbia back in, I think it was in October, and worked out with the East European nations to build a series of rail connections from Serbia, Hungary, Montenegro into Greece. The Russians have reorganized their South Stream oil pipeline to go through Turkey into Greece, bypassing the hostile nations of Europe who are imposing these insane sanctions and attempting to force regime change in Russia. So you have a very clear situation where, in fact, Greece might be the first nation to join the BRICS. Now, on that, I can't help but giving an update from today. I'm sure some of you heard that yesterday the British joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now, this is very, very interesting. This infuriated the White House. The National Security Council in the White House issued a scathing attack on their big brothers in London for daring to join the AIIB after the U.S. has stuck its neck out, threatening nations not to join the AIIB, openly arm-twisting Korea to stay out, arm-twisting Australia to stay out, and here's the British basically saying we're going to join, which will almost certainly lead to a number of Asian nations and European nations and others joining in this new $100 billion infrastructure fund. Now, as you know, the objection from the U.S. and until this moment by Cameron and the British was that the AIIB is going to, and the new development bank of the BRICS is going to supplant the IMF and the World Bank. Well, it won't necessarily supplant it, but if their policy is to continue to invest in no infrastructure, which has been the increasing policy for many years now, then in fact it will supplant. If the Western financial interests, the World Bank and the ADB, Asian Development Bank, refuse to reform their voting rights, which they have not done this for many, many years, knowing that the world has changed, China is a leading force in the world, but they refuse to change the voting there, then in fact it will supplant. But what they most object to is that the Chinese are not imposing conditions on the loans that they will make for infrastructure in Africa, Asia, South America, and so forth. The conditions which say you must privatize your state-run industries, you must impose these environmental conditions, you must cut back on state sector employees, you must cut pensions, the kind of policies that have led to genocide, and I use that word advisedly, in Greece. I think if you look at what the IMF just did in Ukraine, on the one hand, they're going to grant them a 35% debt write-off, exactly what they refused to give to Greece. But they're imposing the same genocidal conditions on Ukraine as they are in Greece and as they've done for many, many years in the developing world. They're forcing them to cut their pensions, lay off state workers, raise the price of their electricity, and so on and so forth. They have no concern for the lives of the people in Western Ukraine. Their only concern is to foment a confrontation with Russia. And here I think it's absolutely crucial that we look at the driving force behind this threat of thermonuclear war. Is it over Ukraine? I say no. I think Putin was correct when he said if it were not for Ukraine, they would have found some other reason. Is it over Syria? No, not really. These are the cockpits for war against the BRICS. The problem in the City of London and in Wall Street is that they recognize that their system is collapsing. And they look at the BRICS and they see that these nations are, in fact, developing and growing, that they're making it impossible for the Western financial interests to go to South America or Africa and say, you must do this or else, because there's another game in town now. And therefore, their view is that this has to be stopped by any means necessary. They're trying to pull off regime change in Moscow and in Beijing. You saw that the very uninfluential opposition leader in Russia, Mr. Nemtsov, was assassinated. And immediately the world said, Russia did it, Putin did it, Putin did it. There would obviously be no reason for Putin to kill this very uninfluential person. And yet, killing him in the shadow of the Kremlin was a global symbol whose purpose was to justify moves for a color revolution, a regime change like the Maidan in Ukraine, where the West openly supported neo-Nazi organizations in a violent overthrow of the Yanukovych government. So the same thing is happening against Xi Jinping. I mean, you've probably seen that virtually every day, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, run an article about how Xi Jinping is the new Mao. He's a dictator. He's shutting down human rights across China. Not a word about the fact that he's building one of the greatest economic development processes, not only in China, but worldwide, that the world has ever seen. That he's uplifting the standard of living of most of the human race, or he and his policies are. And yet, the purpose here, clearly, is to try to justify forcing Xi Jinping, forcing Putin to back down, to accept perhaps color revolutions, and to break up this process of the BRICS. Now, I mean, this is the whole history of man, is the history of a fight between empire and nation builders, which in Greek mythology was the fight between Prometheus and Zeus. Zeus being the god of Olympus, and Prometheus the titan who decided to give the secret of fire to mankind. And for this crime of empowering mankind, Zeus had him chained to a stone where his liver was pecked out every day by eagles, and where he was tormented and tortured for essentially for the rest of time with the intent. Today, the Promethean fire is nuclear power, fusion power, and these great developments. And the Zeus of today is this dying British Empire. The Cameron, Obama, would-be gods of Olympus who think they can stand on top of Mount Olympus throwing their lightning bolts down to kill off whom they need, the way Obama sends his drones hitting anybody he wants to hit anywhere in the world. And yet they don't recognize that the Mount of Olympus is collapsing underneath them. This mountain is falling apart. They can do nothing but destroy at this point. We have a job, and that job is that we have to bring the United States and Europe out from under this self-destructive and globally destructive paradigm, to accept the offer that Xi Jinping made to Obama personally, to his face, at the APEC meeting last November, when in a press conference he said, Mr. Obama, we are not trying to isolate you. We do not want to keep you out of the Silk Road. We do not want to keep you out of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We want you to join us. Please join us in building the world. And if you'll see on the pamphlet, I assume you have some of the pamphlets there, called Why the U.S. Must Join the BRICS. On the back of that is a petition. I'm sure they have the petition there. The United States and Europe must have the courage to reject geopolitics and collaborate with the BRICS on global development. I encourage you all to sign that and to get others at your embassy to sign it. This is the hope for mankind. It's also the necessary step to end this threat of war that could be a war of human annihilation. So I think I'll end it with that. I hope there's some discussion. I think the world is sitting on a precipice between these two paradigms. It cannot last this way for very long. It's going to tip one way or the other into global war, a war which will necessarily be thermonuclear, or it's going to work in creating a true new renaissance where the common aims of mankind drives our nation and your nations and all the world's nations. Again, this is what our task is, and we have a short period of time in which there's a great, great danger. But Mr. LaRouche, I remember when I first met him in 1971, he said it's only when the danger is so great that people put aside their illusions that somehow things will muddle through. And this is a moment where even in the United States, we now see growing numbers of prominent people standing up and saying this policy in Ukraine, in Syria, of going to war, of threatening Russia, of threatening China, is insane, has to be ended. And I think globally, we are in a position where it's possible, precisely because the danger is so great, to really achieve a new renaissance for mankind.